So let's talk about the game last night because, again, as we discussed yesterday, depending on what your overarching goal is for this Mavericks season, you could see it as very good or very bad. You continue to just fall further and further and further away from a real playoff seed. And I think that's one of the issues. So I just wanted to start with that. The Mavericks, not even halfway through the season, are 10 losses back of a real playoff spot. Just let that sink in for a second.
Is that good?
No. Yeah, again, depending on your philosophy. If you're like, oh, man, I don't know, I'm really interested in DeBonsa or Boozer or, depending on that. But you're 10 losses out of a top 6 spot. So it feels like already, if I told you best case scenario, this Mavericks team is a play-in team. Is that a fair assertion, not even halfway through the season?
It's more than fair.
Okay.
Just watch the games.
Yes, and so you lost to a Portland team that's not good, but to be fair, you're not good. But that's one of the teams you would be competing with to get into the 7 through 10 range and potentially be a play-in team. And so while you hear rumblings about, Dumont wants to see the trio all together with Kyrie, AD, and Cooper Flag, you're like, rock on. By the time you get that, it might just be too late. So if that's the way you feel, then last night was a good thing. It looked like for a while the Mavericks were going to kind of get run off the court. At least that's the way I felt like in the probably midway through the third quarter. And then you see a surge from the Mavericks in the last, I wanted to make sure I got this right, the last 40 seconds, they went on a 7-0 run to pull the game really close. And then, if you were watching, the fourth quarter had 5 ties and 8 lead changes. And then the Mavericks just went ahead and lost. So maybe you're like, hey, I want to see some fun basketball. Might not be the best basketball, but it was fun. As long as we end up losing in the end, well, then you got your wish. But the Mavericks lose another game to a team that is not good. They had previously lost to Sacramento. Those are 2 of the worst teams, or that's probably too harsh for Portland. Those are not good teams, and you lost to both of them. And I think it's getting crystallized that, especially with AD out again, this is the team that you're at, and we don't need to put the super trio together to try and make a run at this.
Yeah, I've made it pretty clear that I'm already over it and trying to make a run at it, but then you go and you get beat by Shaedon Sharpe and Caleb Love.
Yeah. Shaedon Sharpe had a sweet in-game windmill dunk there.
Absolutely. And Caleb Love was probably the player of the game for me outside of Max Christie in my mind. I think those were the 2 impact players in this game. And a couple big plays in the fourth quarter from Love really kept it competitive for the Blazers because, like you mentioned, the Mavs do just enough to get me reinvested at the end of games, and then I remember what they truly are.
Yeah.
And it's a team that does not have the clutch factor right now because they don't have a true identity, which is fine. Just lean into it.
You know what's really funny about that? They have played the most clutch games and essentially defined by the last 5 minutes, and they've played more clutch games than anyone in the NBA, and there are times when it looks like, oh yeah, maybe, and then there are times like these last 2 games you're like, okay, never mind. Keep playing competitive and fun basketball. And you notice I keep saying fun. Not good,
sure,
but fun. Now, this next part's not going to be fun, but I want to go around the room and see where you're at on this. I say we should trade Anthony Davis at a discount. What do you say, Alec?
I 100% agree. You take the best value you can possibly get and write it off.
What do you say, Jacob?
I also agree. I think this is a guy you probably want to get off your team and your payroll as soon as possible because I think the more he gets hurt, just the more his value is going to go down. So trade it while it's high now.
All right. So I think those are all valid things. And then when you hear that the Hawks are interested, I know there was rumblings that the Warriors were interested. That does not feel imminent. And that would have to be a 3-team deal, which would complicate matters. So the Hawks make a whole lot of sense. I've got good news and bad news. I think this deal is a great deal for the Mavericks, but there are other people who might not feel that way. The first thing I'm going to warn you of, you're not getting the New Orleans pick. that the Atlanta Hawks hold, because everyone's like, yeah, man, you get that New Orleans pick. Great. If you tell me there's a world in which Atlanta wants to do that, deal, because then there's a very good chance that you'll end up in the top 3 or 4 of the draft again. And there are 3. It feels like that's kind of the line. Maybe people feel differently, but it feels like there's 3 potential studs in this draft, and then there's a bit of a drop off and you go forward from there. So you would have an amazing pick. I don't see any world in which the Atlanta Hawks would want to do that. Now, here's a more reasonable idea that we're going to throw out there. And I was talking with our good buddy, former fan alum, Kevin Gray, about this.
Well,
all right. You get Zachary Reese, the number 1 pick last year. One of these names is going to be jarring. I'm going to warn you ahead of time. You're going to get Luke Kennard, Kristaps Porzingis. Hold on to those thoughts. We'll get back to that. And a first-round pick. Here is why I like most everything about this deal. I like the idea of picking up Reese. He's been somewhat of a disappointment in Atlanta in terms of his development, and I understand that, but that's the whole reason he's available to you. Also, he is a good defender, and he has the potential to be a really good defender, being able to switch off from the 2, the 3, and the 4. So I'm going to start with that. Now, if you hate Luke Kennard and Kristaps Porzingis, I hear you. This is essentially an accounting move. All right, we got to make the numbers match, and you'll get a future first-round pick. Incoming money from this deal, $54.9 million. Outgoing money from this deal, $54.1 million. So the salaries match up. Also, the Mavericks have $1.3 million cap space until you hit the second apron. So you don't have to worry about that with this move. The reason why you would pick up Kennard and Porzingis is just because they're both expiring contracts. So you're talking about, I think, $43 million coming off the books. Compare that to, and Jacob, you just used the term, if you can sell high. Anthony Davis has 2 years and $121 million left on his contract, assuming he triggered his player option for 27-28. And at this point, I don't see how you don't make that assumption. And so you're getting away from all of that future Anthony Davis money. 2 years, $121 million. You're picking up a young player who still has a nice ceiling, and you're getting a first-round pick. And this might be most important, I think it allows you to lean all the way in to say, hey, we're kind of rebooting this whole thing.
I like it. I like it a lot because I think it's more than I would have expected. When you just say, get rid of Anthony Davis, you're getting expiring contracts, which is always a necessity. And it's almost like our quarter-inch adapters for the headphones here in the studio. It is as good as gold. If you can get expiring contracts just to make it through the season and open up some money, I'm always for that. But with Reese, it's interesting because I pulled up the draft scouting report that I had for him going in, and I think he fits the idea of what they would want to fit in with Cooper Flagg. He's got his weaknesses, obviously, because he's already in trade conversations, but a 3-and-D wing that has incredible size. He's an above-average athlete. He has nice mobility, flexibility for his size. He's really light-footed, and he has that really fun leaping one-footed shot that you can see in game. And he looks like he can still put on mass and size,
he definitely can.
You know, he's got the frame to get bigger. So kind of like Mike always talked about with Derek Lively. If he can just put on that grown man weight, per se, I think that he can be the occasional coast-to-coast scorer that you could pair alongside a Cooper Flagg. But
you do have concerns about his general offensive game.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
Fair.
He's not an elite athlete when it comes to just the measurables and stuff right now, but he's got the ability, he's got the frame that we mentioned. And then I just feel like sometimes his readiness and his toughness isn't exactly there, which is it's a mentality thing. But if you pair him up with younger studs like Cooper Flagg and even Ryan Nembhard, guys who are going to score at volume and going to be aggressive from one end of the floor to the other, it's kind of like we talked about with Jason Robertson and Mikko Rantanen getting paired up together.
Yeah.
Is there might be a motivational factor, as weird as it sounds and immeasurable as it is, maybe just fitting into a new system that is playing very different than the Atlanta Hawks style of basketball shows him that maybe I am better at an aggressive play style than I thought I was in Atlanta. So I just think the ceiling for him is already high as a player. But when you give him that fresh start in a different system under Jason Kidd, and maybe he can show you some nicer things defensively here too, I really do think that there is a high ceiling for him. So anything outside of that is just icing on the cake. I love the project player that still has a lot of time to develop and a lot of time to figure things out, especially because I feel like his timeline and his leash is a lot longer in Dallas than it is in Atlanta. So I'm all for it. I'm all for it.
And I think it shows the nature of how weak the 2024 draft was. And we talked about that going in with Reese and Sarr at the top. I mean, I think if you looked at it compared to like this year's mock draft, I think there's a decent shot neither one of those players would go in the top 5. And I saw somebody text in and said anything in the top 10 would be a win because they think there's 10 potential studs. Look, depending on how you feel about Brown from Louisville, we've talked in the past about Lopez out of Mexico. There are absolutely more room, and you've seen tons of drafts where the best player ends up being like Giannis, for example. He's taken in the middle of the first round. It just seems like the consensus is DeBonsa, Peterson, Boozer in whatever order you have them in, and then a bit of a drop-off just in perceived value. Does that mean that's how the player will actually turn out? No, not at all. And so I like the idea that you pick up another pick. Maybe it's in this draft, maybe it's not, but it's this pick is what you control for the Mavs until 2031. Everyone is either dealt or subject to a pick swap. So I like having another first-round pick that you can control. You brought up the importance of having Reese, and he's somebody who doesn't turn 21 until April 8th, and you're able to shed all of that money to give you at least room to consider things. Now, then Kyrie will be a whole discussion after that. I don't have the answers for that just quite here and now. But this is an idea that I think is a feasible trade idea, and I think it's possible. From the 214, in what world would Atlanta agree to that deal? In the world that we live in right now. Let's go to Chris Haynes. Dallas would likely want expiring deals, young assets, and picks, and probably likely to include the number 1 pick from last season, Zach Reese. So if you don't want to, or Zachary, if you don't want to listen to me, listen to him. This is exactly the kind of deal that Atlanta would be interested in, although what has made things more complicated in the last, 36, 48 hours is the idea that at first we heard Atlanta doesn't want to deal Trae Young, and then you immediately hear the follow-up, they're looking at the off-ramp to get rid of Trae Young. So who knows? Maybe that starts a whole different conversation for Atlanta.
It's just such a weird place to be in for Atlanta because they swung and missed with their number 1 pick. What they thought was going to be their franchise player, they want out, and it seems like he wants out too.
Yeah.
They're going to have to hit a hard reset. Their roster is so ugly and constructed so weird. So that's why I think the world that we live in is very real for them to want to make that deal, because they need to get rid of as many things as possible right now so they can try to address as soon as they can.